How a billionaire fell in love with his black janitor. The elevator doors open on the 48th floor of Manhattan's most guarded tower of finance. Alexander Crane, 34 years old and worth billions, steps into his corner office just after sunrise. His gaze locks on something unusual. Resting beside his untouched coffee is a small note, handwritten in graceful cursive. The chess problem you left has 7 possible solutions, but only one leads to true victory. Alexander doesn't move. No one but his closest team ever enters this office. Yet someone has not only solved his challenge, but left an answer sharper than those he usually gets from Harvard-trained analysts. 3 floors below, Gabrielle Washington begins her shift with a cleaning cart, moving quietly through silent hallways. She wears the plain uniform of the night crew, unaware that her careful touch in Alexander's office has started a secret exchange with the man at the very top of the tower. What began as simple curiosity about the person arranging his books would grow into one of the most unexpected romances New York had ever witnessed. The only question is, how could a billionaire and a janitor find each other in a world built to keep them apart? Would you notice if the smartest person in your building wasn't in the boardroom, but quietly working the night shift? Tell us where you're watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow we share another unforgettable story. Let's begin. Alexander Crane woke each day at 4:30 a.m. The city outside his penthouse still lay in silence, but his life had no pause. His mornings began with black coffee made by his own hands, followed by a review of Asian markets on glowing screens while the rest of Manhattan slept. From the windows of his Upper East Side residence, he could see the city stretched out beneath him, steel towers catching the earliest light. At 34, Alexander was one of the youngest billionaires in American finance, a man whose signature could shift industries. Yet beneath the luxury, custom suits, private jets, glass-walled offices, lurked a quiet absence he could never quite explain. He had worked tirelessly since his childhood in Hartford, Connecticut, where his father was a schoolteacher and his mother a nurse. They taught him discipline and ambition, values that propelled him into Ivy League classrooms and later into the financial world. Success came quickly. By 30, his fortune had grown beyond what his parents could even comprehend. But the more he gained, the less he seemed to feel. Business partners praised his brilliance, newspapers chronicled his rise. Yet when the doors of his penthouse closed at night, the silence was heavier than the soundproof glass. 3 states south, Gabrielle Washington's story began very differently. Born and raised in Savannah, Georgia, she grew up in a small shotgun house near Forsyth Park. Spanish moss hung from the oaks, and the air carried the rhythm of her grandmother's voice. Mama Rose raised her after her parents passed away when Gabrielle was still young. From that home filled with hand-me-down furniture and the smell of sweet tea, Mama Rose shaped her granddaughter's character. "Baby girl," she would often say while sweeping the porch or folding laundry, "what you do is never as important as how you do it. Pride in your work is what makes the world respect you." Gabrielle carried those words through every chapter of her life. She excelled at school, went on to earn a master's degree in literature through long nights of study while working part-time jobs to pay tuition. Her dream was to teach, perhaps even write. But New York City proved unforgiving. Applications to publishing houses went unanswered, teaching posts were scarce, and bills never stopped arriving. To survive, she joined a cleaning company. The work was hard, the hours long, but it was honest. Mama Rose's voice in her memory reminded her that dignity had nothing to do with titles or salaries. Each evening, Gabrielle traveled from her modest apartment in Queens into Manhattan. While the day belonged to executives, lawyers, and bankers, the night belonged to people like her, security guards, cleaners, maintenance staff. They moved quietly through skyscrapers after sunset, restoring them for another day of business that would never acknowledge the effort. Few ever saw them, yet their work was the invisible foundation of the city's power. Alexander and Gabrielle's worlds shared the same building, but could not have felt further apart. He occupied the 48th floor, where conference rooms had views of Central Park and offices gleamed with imported wood and marble. She moved through service corridors, industrial stairwells, and utility closets that executives would never notice. He signed deals worth billions under crystal chandeliers, while she scrubbed the glass panels that reflected his city. They passed each other indirectly, one leaving as the other arrived, but never spoke, never even locked eyes. The first sign of change began in Alexander's office late one October evening. He had left a stack of books scattered across his desk, among them a rare edition of F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. When he returned the next morning, the office was immaculate, but more than clean, it was arranged. His collection of books had been reorganized, not alphabetically as before, but by color and size, forming a sequence that felt both orderly and artistic. On his desk, a slip of paper was tucked beneath his coffee cup. The Fitzgerald volume is fragile. The binding may need repair. The handwriting struck him immediately. It was elegant, confident, and educated. Most people in his orbit rushed through notes in careless scrawls, but this was deliberate, crafted with precision. Whoever had touched his books had also recognized the value of that rare edition. Alexander was intrigued. His life, usually predictable, rarely contained surprises. Yet here, hidden in the routine of cleaning staff he never noticed, was someone with insight and subtlety. Someone who not only cared for his possessions, but understood them. Gabrielle, for her part, had not thought much about it. She had seen the loose binding and thought it wrong to leave it unnoticed. Her love for literature could not be switched off, even in uniform with gloves on her hands. To her, the books were treasures, each one a voice across time, deserving of care. Leaving the note felt natural. She never considered that the man in the corner office would notice or care. But Alexander did. And for the first time in years, he felt a spark of curiosity he could not explain. Alexander could not ignore the note. In a world where every interaction felt transactional, this small message carried something different, intelligence wrapped in humility. The following night, he decided to respond in a way that tested whether the person behind the words truly possessed the mind he suspected. Before leaving the office, he wrote out a chess problem on a sheet of paper and placed it deliberately at the center of his desk. He had grown up competing in chess tournaments, and the puzzle he selected was one that required not just skill but creativity. He left without expectation, but returned the next morning with a strange anticipation. The answer was waiting. The problem had been solved flawlessly, but what struck him most was the note attached. There are several paths to checkmate, but elegance lies in choosing the one that teaches patience. The phrasing carried thoughtfulness far beyond the average chess enthusiast. Alexander smiled, something rare for him at the start of a workday. Whoever wrote that reply was not only knowledgeable, but deeply reflective. This became their language. Each evening, he left something, a puzzle, a riddle, a question pulled from mathematics or literature. Each morning, he discovered a response, always written in the same graceful script. Gabrielle, moving quietly through her shift, took each new challenge as a welcome spark in her long nights. She did not know why the man in the corner office had begun leaving puzzles, only that solving them gave her a sense of joy. Her love for learning, often hidden beneath her uniform and routine, found an outlet again. One evening, Alexander shifted from puzzles to poetry. On his desk, he left an open volume of Pablo Neruda with a question written on a slip of paper. Which of these verses carries the most truth? When he returned, the answer was waiting. Love is so short, forgetting is so long. That line holds the weight of all human memory. He sat at his desk for a long moment, staring at the words she had chosen, moved in a way he hadn't felt in years. Soon, the exchanges grew more layered. She would leave subtle marks in his books, underlining passages from Langston Hughes or Toni Morrison. He would respond with notes in the margins, commenting not just on meaning, but on the rhythm of language itself. Their dialogue was quiet, private, yet alive with energy. Alexander found himself staying later at the office, claiming to colleagues that he needed more time with numbers and contracts. The truth was different. He wanted to increase his chances of catching the mysterious writer in the act. Some nights he lingered past midnight, the city glittering outside, waiting for the sound of footsteps in the hall. But Gabrielle, cautious by nature, worked quickly and quietly, slipping in and out of rooms without drawing attention. Their paths never crossed. Yet anticipation built with each note. Both began to look forward to the next exchange, as though it were a conversation spoken aloud. Gabrielle felt seen in a way she hadn't in years. The man in the corner office, whoever he was, valued her thoughts. He had no idea who she was or what uniform she wore, but he treated her mind as equal to his own. That truth alone carried more meaning than she cared to admit. Alexander, on his side, found the correspondence addictive. In boardrooms filled with colleagues who repeated the same ideas, here was someone original. Someone who understood not just logic but nuance. He realized he was beginning his days searching for the note before he opened emails, before he checked markets. His mornings had become brighter, less mechanical, because of the quiet dialogue with an unseen partner. Weeks passed, and the exchange became a rhythm woven into the life of the building. By day, Alexander led meetings and negotiated billion-dollar deals. By night, Gabrielle pushed her cart down hallways that echoed with silence. Yet across the gulf of class and distance, their minds reached toward each other, word by word, puzzle by puzzle, line of poetry by line of poetry. Neither knew who the other was. Neither knew when or if the mystery would end. But both carried the sense that they had found something rare, an understanding that made the sterile walls of an office building feel, for the first time, alive with possibility. December brought a heavy storm across Manhattan. By evening, the city was swallowed in white, traffic stalled, and most employees left the towers early to beat the worsening weather. On the 48th floor, Alexander Crane chose to remain. He had an important presentation to prepare, but if he was honest with himself, the real reason was different. Some part of him hoped the storm might slow down the person who had been answering his puzzles. Near midnight, the building's lights flickered. Moments later, the power cut out before the backup generators restored a dim emergency glow. Alexander stepped into the hallway to check the floor, his footsteps echoing in the quiet. Turning a corner, he nearly collided with someone pushing a cart. Gabrielle steadied herself quickly. "I'm sorry," she said, voice calm but surprised. She had been checking the offices to make sure electronics were powered down. Alexander's eyes locked onto hers, recognizing something in her tone. "You're the one who's been leaving the notes," he said, his voice softer than he expected. Gabrielle hesitated, startled not just by being discovered, but by who was standing before her. The billionaire in the corner office, the man whose world was far above her own, was looking at her as though he already knew her. "You're the one who leaves Neruda open to the most haunting lines," she answered quietly. A silence followed, heavy with realization. For weeks they had spoken across paper, chess problems, and poetry. Now face to face, the invisible wall between their worlds dissolved. Alexander let out a breath, almost a laugh. "I've been trying to stay late just to see you. You're smarter than half my board of directors." Gabrielle lowered her gaze, uncertain how to respond. "I only answered what you left. Books deserve respect. So do questions." That reply struck him deeply. In boardrooms, people tailored answers to please him, to secure favor or opportunity. She spoke with honesty, without fear of consequence. They stood in the faint glow of the emergency lights, snow pressing against the windows. It was as though the storm had forced the city to pause, giving them a private world inside the glass tower. "I never expected this," Alexander admitted. "I thought I'd find a colleague sneaking in after hours, not." His voice trailed off, careful not to reduce her to a role or uniform. "Not someone like me?" she asked, her tone gentle but direct. "Not someone who could understand me this well," he replied. Gabrielle studied him. His words carried no arrogance, only sincerity. She realized that the man who commanded billions of dollars by day was just as human in that moment as anyone else. They began to talk, at first cautiously, then more freely as minutes turned into an hour. Gabrielle told him about her grandmother in Savannah, about earning her degree, about why she still cleaned offices to keep herself afloat in New York. Alexander shared his Connecticut childhood, the pressure to succeed, and how even his wealth hadn't quieted the loneliness that followed him everywhere. The exchange felt natural, as though they had always spoken this way. For weeks they had known each other's thoughts without names or faces. Now, words carried weight because they were finally spoken aloud. By the time the storm outside eased, Alexander no longer cared about his presentation. He cared only about the woman sitting across from him at the edge of the conference table, her cleaning cart parked forgotten nearby. Gabrielle felt the same. She had never expected kindness, curiosity, or respect from someone at his level. Yet here he was, listening as though every word from her mattered. When they finally parted that night, there was no declaration, no dramatic moment, just an unspoken recognition. They both understood that something had begun. Curiosity had given way to connection. The puzzle of notes had become something larger, something alive. Their first meeting during the storm opened a door neither of them wanted to close. What followed were nights that stretched longer than either expected. Alexander began staying in his office after hours, waiting until the building grew quiet. Gabrielle, cautious at first, found herself lingering in conversation whenever their paths crossed. What began as a handful of exchanges soon became hours of discussion. They sat across from each other in the vast conference room, or sometimes by the tall windows overlooking the river, the city glowing below them. They spoke about literature, the way a single line of poetry could alter the course of thought. They spoke about philosophy, about the worth of ambition and the burden of carrying it. Alexander confessed that wealth had given him power, but rarely joy. At the top, he said, the air was thin. Friends came with conditions. Even family treated him as an endless provider, not a man who longed to be understood. Gabrielle listened without judgment. She told him about her grandmother in Savannah, the woman who raised her to value dignity above comfort. She described long nights of study, working double shifts to fund her degree in literature, and how she refused to let debt define her future. She admitted the loneliness of moving to New York, chasing opportunity, yet finding herself overlooked because of where she came from and what she looked like. Their words met in the middle. Each confession stripped away another layer of distance. Over time, their connection shifted. Alexander began to notice not just her intelligence, but the warmth in her laughter, the way her eyes lit when discussing authors she loved. Gabrielle noticed the vulnerability beneath his polished exterior, the tenderness he revealed when he let down the walls he had built since youth. They began sharing smaller pieces of themselves, songs that held meaning, books that shaped them, even meals. Alexander once brought takeout from an expensive restaurant and set it in the break room, only to learn Gabrielle preferred the homemade cornbread she sometimes carried from her grandmother's recipe. He tasted it with genuine appreciation, telling her it was better than anything he had ordered before. She laughed, shaking her head, but her smile lingered longer than usual. Manhattan itself became their silent witness. The city's rhythm provided a backdrop to their unfolding story. They watched snowfall soften the skyline, watched ferries cross the river under silver moonlight, and once stood on the rooftop of the tower after hours, the wind wrapping around them as lights stretched endlessly below. It was there Alexander admitted he had never shared the city with anyone who made it feel alive. One night, as they sat close over an old volume of Baldwin's essays, Gabrielle pointed to a passage about love being both risk and freedom. Alexander read it aloud, his voice low, the meaning settling between them. Their eyes met. Neither needed to explain what they were feeling. Silence stretched, charged with an awareness they could no longer avoid. Alexander reached for her hand slowly, as though giving her the choice to pull away. She didn't. Her fingers met his, steady and sure. That touch was the first acknowledgement of what had been building all along. They were no longer two strangers trading puzzles in secret. They were two souls who had discovered each other across impossible boundaries. The moment was simple, no declarations, no promises, but it marked the beginning of something neither wanted to deny. For the first time in years, Alexander felt seen. For the first time since leaving Savannah, Gabrielle felt chosen not out of pity or convenience, but out of genuine desire. In the heart of a city that never slowed, two people had found the stillness of connection. It was no longer curiosity. It was the quiet certainty of love beginning to take shape. The first warmth of spring had begun to reach Manhattan, softening the city that only months before had been buried under snow. In the late evening light, the skyscrapers shimmered against a fading horizon. Alexander Crane stood by the vast glass wall of his corner office, watching the sun dip below the river. For all his accomplishments, he felt a weight pressing against his chest. A truth he had carried for weeks, but had not yet spoken. Behind him, Gabrielle was gathering her things after another shared evening of conversation. She had grown used to these quiet hours, when the rest of the building was dark, and the two of them sat as though the world outside didn't exist. She looked up from her bag and saw him, not as the billionaire who commanded boardrooms, but as a man standing completely still, hands buried in his pockets, as if searching for courage. "Alexander," she asked softly. He turned, his face illuminated by the last streaks of light. For once, the confident polish was gone. "I can't keep this to myself anymore," he said, his voice lower than usual, almost unsteady. Gabrielle set her bag down, sensing the seriousness in his tone. "I've spent years surrounded by people who wanted something from me," he continued. "Investors, partners, even friends. Every conversation is measured, every interaction calculated. But when I talk to you," he paused, struggling to find the words. "When I talk to you, I'm not a billionaire or an executive. I'm just a man who wants to be understood. And you see me. You've seen me more clearly than anyone ever has." Gabrielle's breath caught. She hadn't expected this moment to come so directly, though she had felt the closeness building for months. "I've tried to reason with myself," Alexander said, taking a careful step toward her. "To remind myself that you and I live in completely different worlds, that people would talk, that I'd risk everything. But none of that matters anymore. What matters is that I've fallen in love with you." The words hung in the air, raw and unguarded. Gabrielle felt her heartbeat quicken. She had imagined what it would be like to hear him admit this, yet reality carried a deeper weight. She looked at him, searching for doubt, but found only honesty in his eyes. "Alexander," she whispered, "you don't know what those words mean to me." He moved closer still, though careful not to reach for her until she gave some sign. "Then tell me." She inhaled deeply, gathering her strength. "I've seen the way people look at you," she said. "They see your wealth, your power, your influence. But I see something different. I see a man who feels alone at the top of a world he never asked for. A man who finds joy not in his fortune, but in a late-night conversation about Baldwin, or in laughing over cornbread in a break room. I see someone who is more than the headlines, more than the numbers in a bank account." Alexander's jaw tightened, emotion flickering across his face. "You've given me something I thought I lost," Gabrielle continued. "A reason to believe that love isn't about circumstances, it's about character. And I love who you are, not what you have." For a moment, silence filled the space. It wasn't hesitation, but reverence. Two people standing at the threshold of something larger than themselves. "So we're both in love," Alexander said, almost in disbelief, as though saying it aloud made it real. Gabrielle smiled, the kind of smile that came not from politeness, but from relief. "Yes, we are." He exhaled sharply, the tension leaving his body. "Do you understand what this means? The world won't be kind. They'll judge you, they'll judge me. They'll say we don't belong together." Her eyes never wavered. "Let them talk. We know the truth. That's enough." Those words were the permission he had been waiting for. Slowly, Alexander lifted his hand and brushed his fingers against hers, tentative at first, until she held onto him firmly. Their closeness made every sound of the city below fade into nothing. He leaned toward her, his voice almost a whisper. "May I?" Gabrielle's answer came not in words, but in the way she tilted her face toward his, her eyes closing with quiet certainty. The kiss they shared was not rushed. It was tender, deliberate, the culmination of months of unspoken longing. His hand rested gently against her cheek, hers pressed against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. In that moment, the barriers of status, race, and expectation dissolved, leaving only the truth of what they had become to each other. When they finally pulled apart, Gabrielle looked up at him with a quiet smile. "For once," she said softly, "I don't feel invisible." Alexander's eyes glistened as he whispered back, "You've never been invisible to me." The office, usually a place of deals and decisions, had transformed into a sanctuary, a space where two people chose love over fear. Outside, the city pulsed with its relentless energy, but inside that room, time had slowed to honor the beginning of something rare. It wasn't a grand spectacle. There were no cameras, no audience. Just two hearts recognizing each other and deciding, against all odds, to walk forward together. That night marked the shift from possibility to reality. They were no longer two strangers exchanging notes in secret corners of a building. They were partners stepping into a love neither had expected, but both were ready to fight for. When Alexander and Gabrielle finally allowed their relationship to move from the shadows of late-night offices into the rhythm of daily life, the city wasted no time in noticing. Manhattan's elite, always alert to new gossip, buzzed with speculation. At cocktail parties on Park Avenue, whispers floated through crystal glasses of champagne. "He's lost his mind," one banker's wife murmured. "With all the women he could have, he chooses her?" A hedge fund magnate shook his head in disbelief. "It'll never last. She won't understand this world." For the first time in years, Alexander found himself at the center of conversation not for his deals, but for his heart. And strangely, he welcomed it. He attended a gala with Gabrielle one evening, choosing deliberately not to hide her. The marble hall was filled with sharp suits and gowns shimmering under chandeliers. Yet when Alexander entered with her hand in his, the air seemed to shift. Some faces smiled politely. Others tightened with disapproval. Gabrielle, dressed simply but elegantly, carried herself with quiet strength. She felt the glances, heard the subtle coughs, but she held her chin high. When Alexander introduced her to an associate, she extended her hand without hesitation, her voice warm, her eyes steady. Later, Alexander leaned toward her as they stood by a balcony. "You handled that better than most of the people in this room," he whispered. She gave a small laugh. "I've been underestimated my whole life. This is just another room." Their relationship faced equal scrutiny from Gabrielle's side. Her friends in Harlem, where she rented a small apartment, were protective. Some worried about her heart, others worried about her safety. "Girl, these men with money, they come and go," her best friend Lila warned. "Don't let him play you like a passing distraction." Gabrielle smiled, shaking her head. "He's not a distraction, Lila. He's different. When we talk, he listens. Really listens. He doesn't see me as someone beneath him. He sees me." Still, doubt lingered among those who loved her. They had seen too many stories where wealth consumed love, where power silenced sincerity. Alexander's family, too, raised objections. His uncle, a hardened figure in finance, confronted him directly. "You're risking everything for this. Investors talk. Partners talk. If you think personal life doesn't bleed into business, you're naive." But Alexander's reply was sharper than his boardroom tone. "If a partnership can't survive my honesty, then it was never strong in the first place." In the midst of these voices, one stood out above all, Mama Rose, Gabrielle's grandmother back in Savannah. When Gabrielle called to share her feelings, her voice carried both excitement and worry. "Mama Rose," she said, "people think I'm out of my mind. They say he doesn't belong in my life. They say I don't belong in his." The old woman's laugh was low and steady, the kind of laugh that came from someone who had seen generations pass. "Child, love don't ask permission from the world. It don't wait for people to approve. It finds you where you are and dares you to accept it." Gabrielle closed her eyes, letting her grandmother's words sink deep. "Remember this," Mama Rose continued. "Character is what makes a man, not the size of his wallet. If his heart honors you, if his spirit lifts you, Then don't you dare let fear steal what God has given. Gabrielle felt tears press against her eyes. He does honor me, Mama. He does. Then walk tall, baby. Walk tall. The rest will follow. Those words became Gabrielle's shield, and she carried them into every room where eyes followed her. For Alexander, the experience of walking beside Gabrielle changed him. He began to see the contrast between the excess of his world and the realities of hers. He noticed the doorman who opened his doors, the staff who cleared his tables, the janitors who polished his floors, the very people who kept his empire polished but invisible. He confessed to Gabrielle one night as they walked through Central Park under the new blooms of spring. Being with you makes me ashamed of how blind I've been. I've lived at the top so long, I forgot how many hold me up from below. Gabrielle squeezed his hand. The fact that you see it now matters more than the years you didn't. You can use what you have differently. That's what makes change. Her words struck him deeply. He began to redirect his wealth not only into investments but into communities, programs for education, libraries in neighborhoods overlooked by his peers. For the first time, his billions felt less like a fortress and more like a tool. The pressure from society didn't disappear overnight. There were nights Gabrielle cried in his arms, exhausted by the constant judgment. There were days Alexander clenched his jaw in meetings, listening to subtle remarks from men who thought love should stay within prescribed boundaries. But each time, they returned to one another. Their love wasn't a shield against pain, but it was an anchor, reminding them why they endured it. One evening, after a particularly difficult dinner where both family and friends had challenged them, Alexander took Gabrielle's hands in his. His voice carried quiet certainty. Let them doubt. Let them whisper. I won't let go of you. Not now, not ever. Gabrielle looked at him, her heart steady. I don't need the world to understand us. I just need you to keep standing with me. I will, he said, his eyes unwavering. Always. Their relationship had begun as an intellectual exchange hidden in scribbled notes. It had blossomed into secret conversations during long nights. Now, it had become a public declaration against the weight of expectation. The whispers of Manhattan, the doubts of friends, the skepticism of family, all became background noise compared to the clarity of what they had chosen. In love, they had found not just each other, but the strength to face the world. Alexander watched Gabrielle walk across the university courtyard, a stack of books clutched to her chest. The spring sun warmed the stone paths as students passed, immersed in their own worlds. She moved with purpose, yet with a lightness that contrasted the weight of Manhattan's executive floors. For the first time, Alexander felt that he was witnessing not only her brilliance but her freedom, the freedom to pursue a dream she had carried quietly for years. Are you ready for your seminar? He asked, following her steps. Gabrielle turned, smiling. As ready as I'll ever be. Alexander had insisted she audit literature classes at Columbia, helping her reconnect with a path she had nearly set aside. He had also introduced her to editors and writers who respected her intellect and insight. Watching her walk confidently into a classroom that once felt out of reach filled him with pride deeper than any financial success could provide. Outside the lecture hall, the city continued its relentless pace, but inside, a new rhythm governed their days. They shared early mornings over coffee and late nights discussing manuscripts. Alexander listened to her ideas about narrative and character, offering support without judgment, letting her know that her mind mattered as much as her presence in his life. Gabrielle, in turn, introduced Alexander to worlds he had overlooked. They explored the quiet streets of Harlem, visited small independent bookstores, and attended readings where authors discussed themes of identity, history, and belonging. Alexander had grown accustomed to boardrooms, luxury galleries, and corporate dinners, yet these experiences grounded him in humility and perspective. He began to see the value of effort beyond money, the dignity in work often unseen by the city above. One evening, after a particularly long day of classes and meetings, Alexander took her hand as they walked along the riverside. The water reflected the lights of the city in a soft shimmer. He paused, holding her gaze. "Gabrielle," he said, voice steady but filled with emotion. "I have something to ask you." Her eyes widened slightly. "Yes." He reached into his coat pocket, producing a small velvet box. Kneeling on the edge of the walkway, he opened it to reveal a ring simple in design but radiant in clarity. "From the moment I first saw you, I understood something I had never known before. That love is not measured by wealth, status, or expectation. It is measured by courage, integrity, and the heart. Will you marry me?" Gabrielle's hand flew to her mouth, tears glistening in her eyes. The words she had longed to hear and feared had arrived simultaneously. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling. 1,000 times yes. They embraced on the quiet riverbank, the city moving around them but unable to touch the space they had claimed together. It was a moment of triumph, not just of romance, but of shared understanding, of choosing each other despite the pressures of their separate worlds. Wedding planning required a delicate balance. Alexander wanted elegance and sophistication. Gabrielle wanted authenticity and warmth. Together, they created a ceremony that honored both traditions. Invitations went out to colleagues and friends, to family and neighbors, to classmates and coworkers. The guest list reflected the lives they had bridged: the wealthy and the working class, New Yorkers and Southerners, old friends and new supporters. During one planning session, Gabrielle placed her grandmother's handwritten recipes beside the catering menu. "This is as important as any flower arrangement," she said. "It tells the story of where I come from." Alexander smiled, adjusting the seating plan. "And it tells everyone here that what matters is heart, not privilege." As they prepared for the wedding, their private lives grew richer in subtle ways. They established routines that blended ambition with intimacy. Mornings might start with her reading a passage from a novel while he reviewed company reports. Nights often ended with discussions about policy, literature, or a shared plan for giving back. Alexander began implementing new initiatives at Meridian Capital, inspired by Gabrielle's perspective. He introduced fair wage programs, created scholarships for young people from underrepresented communities, and prioritized mentorship for employees at all levels. Gabrielle witnessed the transformation firsthand, proud that the man she loved was using influence to foster dignity rather than status. Their relationship matured in these small yet significant ways. Decisions were made jointly, from mundane choices about furniture to profound discussions about philanthropy and personal growth. Both learned patience and empathy. Both discovered the quiet joy of working towards something bigger than themselves, while never losing sight of the love that had begun in whispered notes and shared confidences. One afternoon, Alexander called Gabrielle into his office. The sun was streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, highlighting her hair and the focus in her eyes as she read a new manuscript. He closed the door, reached for her hands, and said, "Do you remember how scared we were when we first faced everyone? All the opinions, all the judgment." She nodded, smiling. It felt like we were standing on the edge of something enormous. He took a deep breath. "And we were. But look at us now. We've built something no one can touch. We've built a life together." Her heart swelled at his words. "And it's only the beginning," she said. Alexander leaned closer, pressing his forehead to hers. "With you, it always feels like the beginning." The wedding day arrived in early summer. The city was alive, but their ceremony was set in Savannah, where Gabrielle had grown up. Alexander stood beside her under the oaks where Spanish moss hung low, the sun warming their faces. Guests filled the historic gardens, laughter and conversation mingling with music that honored both their heritages. When Gabrielle walked down the aisle, every eye turned to her, but Alexander saw only her spirit, the intelligence, humor, and grace that had captured him months before. When they exchanged vows, it was not a recital of promises alone, but a recognition of shared journeys, of worlds combined, of love that had endured scrutiny and distance and emerged unwavering. Later, at the reception, Alexander raised a toast. "We are fortunate," he said, voice carrying across the crowd. "Not because of what we possess, but because of what we've discovered in each other. strength, courage, and the capacity to love without reservation. Let that be the measure of success in our lives. Gabrielle smiled, knowing that their story would continue beyond the celebration. Together, they had not only chosen love, but had chosen to live intentionally, to create a future that honored both who they were and who they could become. And in the quiet moments after the guests had gone, when the city hummed far away, they sat together, hands intertwined, hearts aligned, and understood that the life they had built was more extraordinary than any individual achievement could ever be. The morning of the wedding in Savannah arrived with a calm that seemed to acknowledge the gravity of the day. Forsyth Park, bathed in soft sunlight, held the quiet dignity of centuries of oaks. Spanish moss hung low, brushing the ground with gentle elegance, and the air carried the scent of blooming magnolias. Alexander stood beside his best man, adjusting his cufflinks with a careful hand, though his mind was focused entirely on Gabrielle. Guests began to gather, an unusual mix of Manhattan financiers and Savannah locals, dressed in formal attire and Sunday best alike. Both worlds converged, not merely coexisting, but learning to honor each other. Conversations sparked between stockbrokers and janitors, editors and lifelong neighbors, blending stories and laughter as easily as if they had always belonged together. Gabrielle emerged from the small, restored home where she had prepared, escorted by her grandmother, Mama Rose. The elderly woman's eyes were moist, reflecting pride and emotion accumulated over a lifetime. Her hands, warm and steady, held Gabrielle's for a brief moment. "Go, baby girl. This is your moment," Mama Rose said softly. "Walk tall and take what belongs to your heart." As Gabrielle approached, Alexander's blue eyes held her completely. She was radiant in a gown that combined grace with subtlety, the folds moving like whispered declarations of her journey. Every step was a quiet testament to persistence, intellect, and dignity. The gathering fell silent, yet the stillness was not formal. It was filled with anticipation, wonder, and the recognition that this was a union that transcended expectation. When Gabrielle reached Alexander, he took her hands without hesitation, a steady presence in a world full of observation. Their vows were simple yet profound, reflecting a love built on understanding, intellect, and shared resilience. Alexander spoke of the moments he had first glimpsed her brilliance, the rearranged books, the solved puzzles, the poetry tucked between pages. Gabrielle spoke of the man who listened, who challenged her, and who held her without judgment. Their words resonated with authenticity, bridging every gap society had ever imagined between them. Mama Rose's pride was evident in every glance, every slight squeeze of Gabrielle's hand. She had seen her granddaughter rise above doubt, carry herself with elegance, and finally claim a love that honored her mind and heart equally. Around them, friends and family offered smiles, tears, and quiet nods of respect. The blending of these communities, once distant, was seamless in the spirit of celebration. The reception was held in a grand antebellum mansion nearby, where classical architecture met vibrant southern charm. Guests moved freely between formal dining rooms and sunlit gardens, sampling both caviar and peach cobbler, champagne and sweet tea. Music flowed from a string quartet that transitioned into a gospel choir, marrying the traditions of both regions. Laughter mingled with stories as guests discovered shared values, curiosities, and the delight of genuine connection. During the meal, Alexander raised a glass. "We gather here not to celebrate wealth, titles, or accolades," he began. "We celebrate courage, intellect, and love that refuses to conform to expectation. We celebrate the choice to see another person fully, to recognize the worth that cannot be measured by money or position." The guests listened in thoughtful silence, acknowledging that this wedding was about more than romance. It was about perspective, respect, and the unity of two worlds. Gabrielle, seated beside him, felt a warmth that went beyond emotion. She watched children of both worlds playing in the gardens, adults from different backgrounds discussing ideas and passions. It was proof that love could not only survive societal pressure, but inspire change. She caught Alexander's gaze, a small smile passing between them, and knew that this was the real treasure, a life where hearts and minds were equally valued. As the sun dipped lower, casting a soft golden hue over the mansion and gardens, Alexander and Gabrielle stole a moment alone. The sounds of celebration surrounded them, yet they existed in a quiet sphere of their own. "I never thought I could feel this complete," Alexander whispered, holding her close. "I used to think wealth and success would fill the empty spaces inside me. But you've shown me that richness is not in what I own. It's in who I love and how fully we live together." Gabrielle rested her head against his chest. "And I've learned that my worth is not defined by the opinions of the world. It was always here, but now it's recognized, cherished, and shared." They danced under the open sky, hands intertwined, moving to a rhythm that was uniquely theirs. Every step, every turn, carried the weight of months of intellectual exchange, late-night conversations, and quiet revelations. It was a dance not simply of bodies, but of lives entwined, of hearts claiming the courage to choose each other completely. The legacy of this union extended beyond the ceremony. Alexander implemented new policies at Meridian Capital that reflected the values he and Gabrielle now shared: fair wages, educational opportunities, and recognition for all employees regardless of role. Gabrielle pursued her writing, publishing works that reflected her journey, her intelligence, and her unwavering dignity. Together, they became living proof that love, when grounded in respect and understanding, could transform both private and public spheres. In quiet moments, they returned to Forsyth Park, sitting beneath the moss-draped oaks where Gabrielle had once played as a child. "Do you see it?" she asked, gesturing to the sprawling city beyond the trees. "Our worlds, once so separate, now exist in harmony here." Alexander held her hand tightly. "I see it, and I see us, stronger than we could have imagined. Every challenge we faced, every whisper of doubt, led us to this moment. Nothing else matters except this life we've chosen to build together." Years later, when friends and family gathered at their home, stories of their beginnings, the handwritten notes, the chess puzzles, the intellectual dance that preceded romance, were told with reverence. They were no longer simply a billionaire and a janitor. They were Alexander and Gabrielle, two people who had seen each other fully and built a life around that vision. The real treasure, they realized, was never a diamond, a mansion, or a position of power. It was the understanding that love could elevate the ordinary to extraordinary, that authentic connection transcends color, class, and circumstance, and that the richest life is one filled with mutual respect, support, and affection. Their story became a quiet inspiration, whispered in classrooms, boardrooms, and homes across cities. It was proof that when two people recognize each other's worth, the rest of the world can adjust around them, learning lessons about dignity, love, and the power of seeing beyond appearances. As the sun set over Savannah, casting a warm glow across the gardens and ancient oaks, Alexander and Gabrielle stood side by side, hands linked, hearts in alignment. They had chosen each other, protected each other, and nurtured a life of fulfillment and joy. And in that choice, they discovered the enduring truth. The greatest wealth is found not in what the world offers, but in loving fully and being loved in return. This incredible love story shows us that when two souls recognize each other's worth, nothing else matters. Alexander and Gabrielle prove that love sees no color, no class, no boundaries, only the beauty of two hearts choosing each other. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and share in the comments where you're watching from. Tomorrow, we'll bring another inspiring story that reminds us of the power of love, courage, and human connection. Your support helps us continue sharing stories that touch hearts and transform perspectives.